I watched in horror as thousands of gallons of precious rainwater rushed down the storm drain. Water I had collected drop by drop over months of careful planning. Water that kept our community garden alive during the worst drought in decades. Karen stood there with her clipboard, supervising the destruction like some kind of dictator. Her satisfied smile made my stomach turn. She had no idea what she was destroying. She had no idea that in 3 days, when the heat wave hit, every plant in our neighborhood garden would start dying. The elderly couple who grew tomatoes for their grandchildren, the single mother who fed her family with fresh vegetables, the kids who tended sunflowers taller than themselves. All of it would wither and die because of this woman's obsession with power and control. That was the moment I realized Karen had made the biggest mistake of her life. She just did not know it yet. My name is David, and for the past 5 years, I have lived in what most people would call a perfect suburban neighborhood. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, and neighbors who wave when they see you working in your yard. But what made it truly special was something most people never noticed. Something I kept hidden behind the decorative cedar fencing in my backyard. 3 massive rainwater collection tanks, each holding 1,500 gallons of pure, life-giving water. I had always been passionate about sustainability. When I moved into the house, the first thing I did was install a comprehensive rainwater harvesting system. Gutters fed into underground pipes that connected to my 3 tanks. Every storm, every drizzle, every light rain shower filled my reservoir drop by precious drop. But I was not collecting this water just for myself. For 2 years, I had been the secret guardian angel of our community garden. The garden sat on a small plot of land at the end of Maple Street, donated by a kind elderly woman who wanted to see families grow their own food. It was beautiful. Rows of tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, and herbs stretched across the space. Children had planted sunflowers that grew 10 feet tall. Elderly residents tended vegetables with the care of master gardeners. The problem was water. The city had installed a single spigot, but during summer droughts, water restrictions made it nearly impossible to keep anything alive. Plants would wilt, families would lose months of work, and hope would die along with the vegetables. That was when I started my secret mission. Every morning at dawn, before the neighborhood woke up, I would load my truck with containers of rainwater. I would drive to the garden and quietly fill the irrigation system I had helped install. No one knew where the water came from. They just knew their plants stayed green and healthy even during the driest months. Mrs. Rodriguez grew enough tomatoes to feed her family of 6. Old Mr. Peterson tended a patch of herbs that helped with his arthritis pain. The Johnson kids had a section where they grew carrots and radishes, learning responsibility and the joy of growing their own food. I never told anyone about my contribution. The satisfaction of seeing flourishing plants and happy families was reward enough. I would check my tanks every evening, calculating how much water I could spare without running short for my own needs. It became a careful balance, a quiet dance between conservation and generosity. My system was perfectly legal. I had researched every city ordinance and building code. Rainwater collection was not just allowed, it was encouraged. My tanks were properly installed, safely enclosed, and completely compliant with all regulations. The neighborhood had always been peaceful. Our HOA was mostly inactive, handling basic maintenance and sending out annual reminders about holiday decorations. The previous board was made up of reasonable people who understood that neighbors sometimes need flexibility and understanding. But things were about to change. Elections were coming up, and I had heard rumors about new candidates who wanted to crack down on violations and raise property values. I had even received a flyer about stricter enforcement of community standards. I should have paid more attention to those warnings. I should have realized that my quiet paradise was about to be invaded by someone who saw problems where none existed. Someone who would stop at nothing to impose her vision of perfection on the rest of us. If I had known what was coming, I would have prepared better. I would have documented everything, gathered support from neighbors, and built defenses against the storm that was approaching. Instead, I continued my peaceful routine, checking tanks and watering plants, completely unaware that my world was about to be turned upside down by a woman with a clipboard and a dangerous amount of power. Her name was Patricia Kellerman, but everyone would soon know her simply as Karen. She moved into the neighborhood 6 months before the HOA elections, and within weeks, she was knocking on doors and making promises about improving property values and maintaining community standards. Karen was the kind of person who noticed everything and approved of nothing. She was in her early 50s, always perfectly dressed, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed she knew better than everyone else. Her smile was sharp, her handshake was firm, and her eyes missed nothing. The first time I met her, she was walking through the neighborhood with a clipboard, taking notes on every house she passed. I was working in my front garden when she approached my driveway. "Hello there," she said, her voice friendly but somehow cold. "I am Patricia Kellerman, your new HOA president. I am conducting a comprehensive review of property compliance in our community." I introduced myself and tried to be polite. "Welcome to the neighborhood. What kind of compliance issues are you looking for?" "Oh, you would be surprised how many violations people overlook," she replied, making a note on her clipboard. "Unauthorized structures, improper storage, vehicles parked incorrectly. Small things that can really impact our property values if left unchecked." Something about her tone made me uncomfortable, but I tried to stay friendly. "Well, I think most of us do our best to keep things looking nice." "That is exactly the attitude that leads to problems," Karen said, her smile becoming even sharper. "People think they are doing their best, but they do not understand the bigger picture. They do not see how their choices affect the entire community." She walked around my property, examining everything with the intensity of a detective looking for evidence. When she reached my backyard fence, she stopped and peered through the gaps between the cedar boards. "What is that back there?" she asked, pointing toward my water tanks. My heart started beating faster. "Those are rainwater collection tanks, completely legal and up to code." She said, making another note. "We will see about that. There are regulations about structures, even legal ones. Aesthetic considerations, setback requirements, permit compliance. I will need to research this thoroughly." I tried to explain that I had done all the research myself, that everything was properly installed and permitted. But Karen was not interested in my explanations. She had already made up her mind that my tanks were a problem that needed solving. Over the next few days, Karen launched what I can only describe as a campaign of harassment. She called the city planning office to request copies of my permits. She researched HOA bylaws looking for any rule that might apply to my water collection system. She even knocked on my neighbors' doors, asking if they had concerns about my unauthorized water storage. The phone call started a week later. "This is Patricia Kellerman from the HOA board," she would say. "I have some concerns about the structures in your backyard. We need to discuss compliance issues." I tried to be reasonable. I invited her over to see the system up close, to review my permits and documentation. I explained the environmental benefits of rainwater collection and how it helped reduce runoff during storms. Karen was not interested in benefits or explanations. She had decided that my tanks were ugly, potentially dangerous, and possibly illegal. Nothing I said would change her mind. Property values are my primary concern, she told me during one heated phone conversation. Your tanks may be legal, but they are an eyesore. They make the neighborhood look like some kind of survivalist compound. I pointed out that the tanks were completely hidden behind my fence, invisible from the street or neighboring properties. Karen claimed she was worried about precedent. If we allow one person to install whatever they want in their backyard, where does it end? She argued. Next thing you know, people will be putting up sheds without permits, storing junk cars, turning their yards into junkyards. The situation escalated quickly. Karen recruited 2 other board members to support her position. She organized a special meeting to discuss unauthorized structures and community standards. She even hired a lawyer to research legal options for forcing me to remove my tanks. 3 weeks after our first meeting, Karen delivered the final blow. She arrived at my front door with an official HOA violation notice, printed on legal letterhead and signed by all 3 board members. You have 30 days to remove the water storage tanks from your property, she announced, her voice cold and official. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $200 until the violation is corrected. I read the notice with growing disbelief. The charges were ridiculous. Unauthorized structures, aesthetic violations, potential safety hazards. None of it was true, but Karen had found obscure HOA bylaws that could be interpreted to support her position. This is insane, I told her. These tanks are helping the community. They are completely legal and properly installed. That is for the board to decide, Karen replied, her satisfaction obvious. You have 30 days. I suggest you start making arrangements. As she walked away, I realized that Karen had declared war on me and my water tanks. She did not care about facts, legal compliance, or community benefit. She cared about power and control, and she had decided that I was going to be her first example of what happened to people who did not follow her rules. The battle was just beginning, and I had no idea how devastating the consequences would be. The next 30 days were the most stressful of my life. I threw myself into research, determined to prove that Karen's violation notice was baseless and illegal. I spent hours at the city planning office, pulling permits and building codes. I consulted with lawyers, contacted environmental groups, and reached out to other homeowners who had faced similar HOA disputes. Every piece of evidence I found supported my position. My rainwater collection system was not only legal, it was encouraged by city and state environmental policies. I had obtained all necessary permits before installation. My tanks met or exceeded all safety and construction standards. But Karen was not interested in facts or evidence. Our first formal meeting took place in the community center conference room. Karen sat at the head of the table with her 2 board allies, looking like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. I brought binders full of documentation, legal precedents, and environmental studies supporting rainwater collection. I appreciate your research, Karen said after I finished my presentation. But this is not about environmental policy. This is about community standards and property values. Your tanks are an eyesore and a potential liability. I pointed out that the tanks were completely hidden and posed no danger to anyone. Karen claimed she was worried about mosquitoes, structural failure, and water contamination. When I provided documentation proving these concerns were groundless, she shifted to aesthetic arguments. The principle matters more than the specifics, she insisted. If we allow large water tanks, what comes next? Swimming pools without permits, garden sheds blocking sight lines. We have to maintain standards. The meeting went nowhere. Karen had made her decision before I walked into the room. Her board allies nodded along with everything she said, clearly intimidated by her forceful personality. I tried appealing to individual board members privately, hoping to find someone reasonable who would listen to facts. But Karen had chosen her allies carefully. They were either afraid of confronting her or genuinely believed she was protecting the community from my dangerous water tanks. As the deadline approached, my stress levels skyrocketed. I was barely sleeping, constantly researching legal options and preparing appeals. The worst part was watching the community garden start to suffer. I had been forced to reduce my water deliveries, afraid that Karen might discover my secret mission and use it against me somehow. The plants were beginning to show signs of stress. Leaves yellowed slightly, growth slowed, and I could see worry in the faces of the families who depended on their garden plots. Mrs. Rodriguez asked me if I knew why the irrigation system seemed to be running low. Old Mr. Peterson mentioned that his herbs were not growing as vigorously as usual. I wanted to tell them everything, to explain that their garden was caught in the middle of Karen's war against me, but I was afraid of making things worse. I tried reaching out to other neighbors for support, hoping to build a coalition against Karen's unreasonable demands. But most people were either unaware of the situation or unwilling to get involved in what they saw as a private dispute. Just remove the tanks and end the drama, one neighbor suggested. Is it really worth fighting over some water barrels? They did not understand what was at stake. This was not about water barrels or aesthetic preferences. This was about whether one person with a clipboard could destroy something good and useful simply because they did not like how it looked. Karen escalated her pressure tactics as the deadline approached. She sent daily emails listing my violations and demanding compliance. She hired a lawyer to research legal options for forced removal. She even contacted my homeowner's insurance company, claiming my tanks were an undisclosed liability that could void my coverage. The most infuriating part was Karen's complete lack of curiosity about what my tanks actually did. She never asked why I collected rainwater or how I used it. She never showed any interest in understanding the benefits of water conservation. She had decided my tanks were bad, and nothing else mattered. 5 days before the deadline, I made one final attempt to reason with her. I called and asked for a private meeting, hoping to find some compromise that would satisfy her concerns without destroying my water collection system. There is nothing to discuss, Karen told me coldly. You have 5 days to remove those tanks or face daily fines. The decision is final. You do not understand what you are doing, I pleaded. These tanks serve an important purpose in our community. People depend on this water. I do not care what people depend on, Karen snapped. I care about property values and community standards. Your tanks violate both, and they are coming down. The line went dead. I sat in my kitchen, staring at my phone, realizing that reason and evidence meant nothing to someone drunk on power and control. That night, I made a decision that felt like surrender. I would not remove my tanks, but I would not fight the fines either. I would let Karen have her victory and deal with the consequences. I had no idea those consequences would destroy her more completely than anything I could have planned. The community garden was about to teach Karen a lesson she would never forget. The morning of the deadline arrived with typical summer heat. The forecast promised temperatures over 90 degrees for the next week, with no rain in sight. It was exactly the kind of weather that made water precious and gardens vulnerable. I was drinking coffee in my kitchen when I heard the trucks pull up outside. Through my window, I watched Corinne step out of her SUV, followed by two city workers and a water truck equipped with drainage equipment. My heart sank. Corinne had not just come to issue fines. She had come to destroy my water collection system completely. I rushed outside to confront them. What is going on here? You cannot just drain my tanks without permission. Corinne held up an official-looking document. This is a city order for emergency drainage of unauthorized water storage. The fire department determined that your tanks pose a safety hazard and must be emptied immediately. I knew she was lying. My tanks posed no safety hazard, and the fire department had never inspected them. But Corinne had somehow convinced city officials to support her campaign of destruction. You cannot do this, I protested. That water is legally collected rainwater. You have no authority to waste it. Actually, we do, Corinne replied, her voice dripping with satisfaction. Improperly stored water can become a breeding ground for mosquitoes and bacteria. Public health trumps your environmental hobby. The city workers looked uncomfortable but followed Corinne's directions. They connected drainage hoses to my tanks and began the process of emptying thousands of gallons of precious water directly into the storm drains. I watched in horror as water I had collected drop by drop over months of careful planning rushed away into the sewer system. Water that had been crystal clear and perfectly clean disappeared forever, wasted because of one woman's obsession with control. Corinne supervised the destruction with obvious pleasure. She stood with her clipboard, checking off items on some kind of official form, smiling as my life's work disappeared down the drain. This is insane, I told her. You are wasting thousands of gallons of clean water during a drought. I am protecting our community from unauthorized structures and potential health hazards, Corinne replied. You should have thought about waste before you decided to ignore HOA regulations. The drainage process took over 2 hours. My first tank held 1,500 gallons. My second tank held 1,200 gallons. My third tank held 800 gallons. A total of 3,500 gallons of rainwater collected over 8 months of storms, gone forever. As the last drops disappeared, I felt something break inside me. This was not just about water or tanks or HOA regulations. This was about power and cruelty, about someone who enjoyed destroying things simply because they could. I hope you are satisfied, I said to Corinne as the workers packed their equipment. Very satisfied, she replied. Maybe next time you will think twice before ignoring community standards. Actions have consequences. Corinne had no idea how true those words would prove to be. After the trucks left, I stood in my backyard staring at my empty tanks. Months of careful water conservation, thousands of gallons of precious liquid, all wasted because of one person's petty tyranny. But the real tragedy was not my loss. The real tragedy was what would happen to the community garden over the next few days. That afternoon, I drove past the garden to assess the situation. The plants were already showing stress from the heat. Without my secret water deliveries, the irrigation system was running low. The city spigot could not provide enough water to sustain the entire garden during peak summer temperatures. Mrs. Rodriguez was there with her grandchildren, trying to hand water her tomato plants with a small watering can. The kids looked confused and worried as they watched their sunflowers starting to wilt. "The water pressure seems really low today," Mrs. Rodriguez said when she saw me. "I hope it is just a temporary problem." I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to explain that her garden was dying because of Corinne's war against my water tanks. But I was afraid of making things worse, afraid that Corinne might somehow use my involvement against the garden itself. That evening, I sat on my back porch listening to my empty tanks tick and settle in the cooling air. For 2 years, those tanks had been full of purpose and potential. Now they were just expensive decoration, monuments to one woman's power to destroy good things. I thought about all the water I would not be able to deliver, all the plants that would struggle and die, all the families who would lose months of work because Corinne could not stand the sight of hidden water tanks. The heat wave was just beginning. Temperatures would climb above 90 degrees for the next 7 days. Without supplemental water, the community garden would start dying within 48 hours. Corinne had won her battle against my tanks, but she had no idea that victory would cost her everything she claimed to care about. She had no idea that destroying my water storage would expose her as the true threat to community values and property welfare. In her obsession with control and appearances, Corinne had made the biggest mistake of her life. She just did not know it yet, but she would learn soon enough when angry neighbors started asking why their garden was dying and what she planned to do about it. The reckoning was coming, and it would be more devastating than anything I could have planned myself. The heat wave hit with merciless intensity. Day after day of 90-plus temperatures, cloudless skies, and no relief in sight. Without my secret water deliveries, the community garden began dying exactly as I had feared. I drove past the garden every morning, watching the slow-motion disaster unfold. Plants that had been vibrant and healthy just days before started showing serious stress. Tomato leaves curled and yellowed. Pepper plants drooped despite morning watering. The children's sunflowers, once standing proud and tall, began to bow their heavy heads toward the ground. The families who tended garden plots grew increasingly worried and confused. They were doing everything right, watering when allowed, mulching to retain moisture, but their plants continued to decline. Mrs. Rodriguez was the first to ask the obvious question. I was working in my front yard when she approached, looking frustrated and concerned. "David, you know about plants and watering. Do you have any idea why our garden is struggling so much? We have never had problems like this before." I felt sick lying to her, but I was not ready to reveal my role in the crisis. It has been an unusually hot summer. Maybe the city water restrictions are affecting the irrigation system. "That is what I was thinking," she agreed. "But it seems worse than just water restrictions. It is like the plants were getting extra water before, and now they are not." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Mrs. Rodriguez was exactly right. The plants had been getting extra water before, my water, and now they were dying because of Corinne's destructive obsession with control. Over the next 2 days, more families approached me with similar concerns. Old Mr. Peterson mentioned that his herb garden had never struggled like this. The Johnson kids were devastated watching their vegetables wither despite their careful attention. "It does not make sense," Mr. Peterson told me. "These plants were doing so well just last week. Now it is like they are dying of thirst no matter how much we water them." I knew I had to do something, but I was not sure what. My tanks were empty, and Corinne had made it clear that any attempt to refill them would result in immediate fines and legal action. I was trapped between my desire to help and my fear of making things worse. Then Corinne made her second critical mistake. She decided to take a victory lap through the neighborhood, probably expecting praise for her decisive action against my unauthorized water storage. What she found instead were angry, worried neighbors demanding answers about their dying garden. Mrs. Rodriguez confronted Karen first, right there on Maple Street in front of the garden entrance. "Patricia, we need your help," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice strained with worry. "Our garden is in crisis. Plants are dying despite our best efforts. As HOA president, can you contact the city about increasing our water allocation?" Karen's response revealed just how little she understood about the community she claimed to represent. "I am sorry to hear about your gardening troubles," Karen said dismissively, "but the HOA does not get involved in hobby projects. If your plants are dying, maybe you should choose varieties better suited to our climate." The coldness in Karen's voice shocked Mrs. Rodriguez. "This is not a hobby project. This garden feeds families. Children learn responsibility here. Elderly residents depend on these vegetables." "That sounds like a personal problem, not an HOA issue," Karen replied. "I have more important concerns than failed tomato plants." Word of Karen's callous response spread through the neighborhood within hours. People were outraged that their HOA president showed such complete disregard for a community resource that brought neighbors together. But Karen's biggest mistake was yet to come. When Mr. Peterson approached her the next day asking for help coordinating a neighborhood response to the garden crisis, Karen made a comment that would destroy her credibility forever. "Maybe this garden failure is a blessing in disguise," she told him. "That plot of land would be much better used for something that actually improves property values. A small park with professional landscaping, perhaps." Mr. Peterson was stunned. "You want to get rid of our garden? Families have been working these plots for 3 years. Children have grown up learning to garden here." "Sentiment is nice, but property values are more important," Karen replied. "A well-designed park would benefit everyone, not just the few people who want to play farmer." When Mr. Peterson shared Karen's comments with other neighbors, the reaction was swift and angry. People who had been neutral or supportive of Karen's tough stance on community standards suddenly realized she did not care about the community at all. She cared about her vision of perfection, regardless of what neighbors actually wanted or needed. But the worst was yet to come. As the heat wave continued and more plants died, neighbors started asking harder questions about the timing of the garden crisis. Someone remembered that the problem started right after Karen had forced me to drain my water tanks. Someone else wondered if there might be a connection between my water collection system and the garden's previous success. Karen was about to learn that communities have long memories, and that destroying something people love has consequences she never imagined. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. Mrs. Rodriguez was at the garden with her grandchildren, trying to save what remained of their tomato plants, when 8-year-old Sophia started crying. "Abuela, why are all our plants dying? Did we do something wrong?" Mrs. Rodriguez held her granddaughter close, looking around at the withering vegetables they had tended so carefully. That was the moment she decided enough was enough. Within an hour, Mrs. Rodriguez had called every family associated with the garden. Within 2 hours, she had contacted neighbors throughout the community. By Friday morning, word was spreading about an emergency neighborhood meeting to address the garden crisis and Karen's leadership. I learned about the meeting from Mr. Peterson, who knocked on my door Friday afternoon. "David, we are having a community meeting tomorrow night about the garden situation," he told me. "People are angry about Patricia's attitude, and some folks are starting to ask questions about timing. They remember your water tanks being drained right before the problem started. My heart raced. What kind of questions? Smart questions, Mr. Peterson replied. Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned that her plants were thriving until just after that whole drama with your tanks. She is wondering if there might be a connection. I realized the truth was about to come out whether I wanted it to or not. People were putting pieces together, and Corinne's callous response had made them determined to find answers. Saturday evening, the community center was packed. 43 families showed up, many bringing children who had worked in the garden. The anger in the room was palpable. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up first. We are here because our community garden is dying, and our HOA president does not seem to care. But before we talk about solutions, I think we need to understand what really happened. She looked directly at me. David, people are saying your water tanks were connected to the garden somehow. We need to know the truth. The room fell silent. Every eye was on me. I realized this was my moment to either continue hiding or trust my community with the truth. I stood up slowly. For 2 years, I have been secretly supplying water to the community garden from my rainwater collection tanks. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, exclamations, and then a burst of questions. Every morning before dawn, I would load my truck with rainwater and fill the irrigation system, I continued. During droughts, when city water restrictions made it impossible to keep plants alive, my tanks provided the extra water your garden needed to thrive. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up again, her voice shaking with emotion. You have been helping us all this time, without telling anyone. I did not want recognition, I explained. I just wanted to help. But when Corinne forced the city to drain my tanks, I lost 3,500 gallons of water that would have kept your garden alive during this heat wave. The room erupted. People were angry, grateful, and outraged all at the same time. They were angry at Corinne for destroying the water supply. They were grateful to me for my years of secret service. They were outraged that Corinne's petty power play had cost them their garden. Then Corinne walked in. She had clearly heard about the meeting and come to defend herself. But the moment she entered the room, the atmosphere changed. 43 families turned to stare at the woman who had destroyed their water source and then dismissed their concerns about dying plants. I heard there was some kind of unauthorized meeting about garden problems, Corinne announced. I want to remind everyone that the HOA does not support private meetings that exclude board members. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward. Patricia, we just learned that David has been supplying water to our garden for 2 years, water that came from the tanks you forced him to drain. Corinne's face went pale. For the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely shocked. That is impossible, she stammered. Those tanks were just collecting rainwater. There is no way they could supply an entire garden. 3,500 gallons of rainwater, Mr. Peterson said quietly. That is what David collected over 8 months. That is what you wasted. The room was dead silent as the full scope of Corinne's mistake became clear to everyone, including Corinne herself. I did not know, she whispered. You did not want to know, Mrs. Rodriguez replied, her voice cold with anger. David tried to tell you the tanks served a purpose. You did not care. You were too busy playing dictator to listen. What followed was 20 minutes of the most devastating public reckoning I have ever witnessed. Family after family stood up to share what the garden meant to them and to condemn Corinne's destruction of their water source. Parents talked about children learning responsibility and the joy of growing food. Elderly residents described how gardening gave them purpose and community. Families explained how fresh vegetables helped them save money and eat healthier. Through it all, Karen sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that her obsession with control and appearances had destroyed something precious and irreplaceable. The meeting ended with a unanimous vote of no confidence in Karen's leadership and a demand for her immediate resignation from the HOA board. Karen left without saying another word, but everyone knew this was not over. A community that had been awakened to injustice would not go back to sleep quietly. Karen resigned from the HOA board 3 days later. Her letter was brief and defensive, claiming she had acted in the best interests of property values and community standards. She took no responsibility for the garden crisis and offered no apology for her destructive actions. But the neighborhood had moved beyond needing Karen's apologies. We were too busy rebuilding what she had tried to destroy. The emergency community response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours of the meeting, neighbors had organized a fund to purchase temporary irrigation equipment. Local businesses donated hoses, sprinkler systems, and water containers. Even the city council, embarrassed by their role in draining my tanks, temporarily lifted water restrictions for garden use. Mrs. Rodriguez coordinated the rescue effort with military precision. Families took shifts watering plants throughout the day. Teenagers volunteered to run hoses and check on struggling vegetables. Even neighbors who had never been involved with the garden showed up to help save what remained of the community project. I was finally able to tell my full story without fear of Karen's retaliation. People were amazed to learn about my secret water deliveries and touched by my years of quiet service. But more importantly, they were determined to make sure the garden never faced this kind of crisis again. The new HOA board, elected in an emergency vote, immediately reversed Karen's policies and officially endorsed my rainwater collection system. They even passed a resolution encouraging other neighbors to install similar conservation measures. Within 2 weeks, my tanks were refilled and back in operation. But now I was not working alone. 3 other families had installed their own rainwater collection systems. The community had committed to funding a permanent backup irrigation system, and everyone knew where the water came from. The garden not only survived Karen's assault, it emerged stronger than ever. The crisis had brought neighbors together in ways that normal times never could. People who had barely spoken before were now working side by side, united by their shared commitment to keeping the garden alive. 2 months later, as I stood in the flourishing garden watching children harvest vegetables they had saved from Karen's destruction, I realized that her attempt to destroy our community had actually made it stronger. Mrs. Rodriguez's tomatoes were bigger than ever. Mr. Peterson's herbs had recovered completely. The Johnson kids' sunflowers stood 12 feet tall, stretching toward the sky like monuments to resilience and community spirit. Karen had moved away from the neighborhood by then, unable to face the daily reminder of her failed power grab. Her house sold quickly to a young family who immediately asked about joining the garden waiting list. The new HOA president was Mrs. Rodriguez, elected unanimously by neighbors who had learned the difference between leadership and control. Her first official act was to install a plaque at the garden entrance recognizing all the volunteers who had helped save the community project. Standing in that garden, surrounded by thriving plants and happy families, I understood something Karen never could. Real community is not about control or compliance or property values. It is about neighbors helping neighbors, about quiet acts of service, and about people coming together to protect what they love. My water tanks still hum quietly in my backyard, filling drop by drop with every rain. But now they are not just my secret. They are part of something bigger, something that cannot be destroyed by petty tyrants with clipboards. The garden grows on, and so does our community.